In 1998, Derrida gave a lecture before an audience of French literary translators of the Association Atlas, which is an association of literary translators, entitled Qu'est-ce qu'une traduction relevante? At the heart of this lecture is his translation and his gloss of several pivotal lines from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice that serve as epigraphs to his lecture, and which repeatedly come up as a part of this lecture. And the two lines that open this particular lecture is, "Then the Jew must be merciful." Je ne traduis pas cette phrase de Portia dans Le Marchand de Venise. Portia dira aussi, "When mercy seasons justice," que je proposerai plus tard de traduire par "Quand le pardon relève la justice." So these are really the critical lines, and we'll be talking about how this keeps coming up throughout this lecture. This lecture has a firm place within the discipline of translation studies, as Derrida evokes ideas here that have clearly appealed to Anglophone translation studies scholars eager to include this lecture within the broad lines of the history of translation theory. Derrida here makes several theoretical pronouncements about translation, including the idea that a translation's relevance is analogous to its assumed quality. So this is the first quotation. Une traduction relevante serait donc tout simplement une bonne une traduction qui fait ce qu'on attend d'elle. En somme, une version qui s'acquitte de sa mission, honore sa dette et fait son travail ou son devoir en inscrivant dans la langue d'arrivée l'équivalent le plus relevant d'une originale, le langage le plus juste, approprié, pertinent, adéquat, opportun, aigu, univoque, idiomatique, etc. He also makes a declaration that recalls the so-called debate between word for word and sense for sense methods of translation from antiquity. This is our second citation on the screen. Tel qu'il fut formulé, entre autres, par Cicéron, je crois, le premier impératif de la traduction, ce ne fut certes pas, vous le savez, l'ordre du mot à mot. Dans le De Optimo Genere Oratorum, Cicéron a franchi la traduction de son obligation envers le verbum, de sa dette envers le mot pour mot. L'opération qui consiste à convertir, à tourner, convertere, vertere, transvertere, n'a pas à se laisser prendre au mot ou à prendre le mot à la lettre. And yet, a closer look at these explicit statements on translation reveals Derrida proffering these ideas in an offhand way, using verbal markers of informality, like tout simplement and etc., and of doubt, like je crois. I think that this was formulated by Cicero, which indicates the extent to which these truisms of basic translation theory, as taught in many MA programs, do not lie at the heart of his concerns here. Catherine Batchelor has written that in this lecture, Derrida demonstrates the power of translation to prompt philosophical reflection. Her in-depth reading and unraveling of the multilingual and polysemic meanings of relevant, and by extension of relevance and of relève in his gloss of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is integral to her cogent argument that we should read this lecture within the context of Derrida's long-standing investigations of forgiveness, justice, and mercy. I concur. Derrida's lecture serves as my point de départ for thinking through the relationship between translation and rhetoric. And I have to confess here, and it's probably going to sound a little funny, but I confess that when I reread this lecture, I didn't expect to find rhetoric and oratory even as a major feature of his discourse, despite my longstanding pedagogical engagement with Derrida and with this lecture in particular on translation more specifically. I expected, as usual, dazzling philosophical sleights of hand and enthralling, at times frustrating, linguistic inflected metaphysical analyses, but I didn't remember the rhetoric of this lecture. And I confess this in full recognition of the fact that I, of all people, should have been especially attuned to seeing rhetoric as an element of translation and vice versa. I'd never expected to see in rereading Derrida's lecture glimpses of how rhetoric may launch translation into a sphere far more expansive than that of the intimacy of translator and text as described by someone like Spivak. Derrida's lecture compels us, I think, to think more deeply about the place of translation and of the translator in a public rather than simply a private sphere. So I'm going to be suggesting here that Derrida's lecture, his unraveling and reassembling of this term relève, on which the whole of the lecture is based, asks the translators in the audience, and by extension, we as listeners, or in this case readers, to surrender to his linguistic and philosophical rhetoricity. But rather than focusing on relevance and its related words, as do most scholars, and again, most recently, as did Catherine Batchelor at last fall, I will argue here that Derrida's use of rhetoric compels us to pay closer attention to the function of the homophonic pair merci, merci, as it offers a way into the broad and public questions interrogated in this lecture, and how these are manifest in and form the basis of Derrida's rhetorical ethos, and his rhetorical ethos as a translator. That is, although we might be led to think that the lecture is simply an abstract rumination on translation before an audience of translators, Derrida's self-positioning within rhetoric, or his rhetorical ethos, unveils the very topical political stakes of translating merci in the context of Shakespeare's play and beyond. My gloss of this lecture is divided into 3 sections, the first of which is dedicated to the numerous markers of rhetoric in Derrida's Atlas lecture, and the second to his rhetorical framing of merci, and how this pair evokes similar resonances in his contemporaneous seminars that he gave academically on perjury and forgiveness. The third section, by far the most weighty here, explores Derrida's rhetorical ethos as it is fashioned via merci. We see this not only in philosophical terms as the exteriorization of sentiment, but also in religious and political terms via the themes of confession and conversion, and of mercy as an object of exchange, as Derrida creates an ethos that responds to the position of the Jewish Shylock of the Merchant of Venice. Again, the Jewish character of Shylock of the Merchant of Venice. So we'll begin now. Whereas Peter France has argued convincingly that the translator is generally in a rhetorical situation, the scholarship on Derrida's Atlas lecture tends to overlook its oratorical nature, which is nevertheless one of its primary features. A careful reader may protest at the seeming superficiality of such a statement, as the text that we read is the slightly modified text of an address that he gave, and is thus de facto discursive in nature. And yet, Derrida highlights with clear and repeated verbal markers that he places himself in a rhetorical position. What's more, he does so not only with the use of the second person plural to address the audience directly, although these two would have rendered the audience attentive and open to persuasion in a way that evokes Cicero's precepts for successful oratory in De Inventione 116:23. In fact, throughout this lecture, Derrida calls explicit attention to his oratorical self-positioning. And just a note to say that I'm really using oratory and rhetoric in this particular context as synonyms. Recalling Quintilian's advice in Institutio Oratorio 4 1.1, Derrida begins his lecture by using the various means of the oratorical captatio benevolentiae, appealing to his audience to gain their goodwill and approbation, and laying the groundwork for the audience to be more receptive to the ideas he will present. First, Derrida praises and even flatters his audience by characterizing the audience as united in their desire and concern for, and their knowledge and expertise in translation. Vous qui faites de cette tâche sublime et impossible votre désir, votre inquiétude, votre travail, votre savoir et votre savoir-faire. He also characterizes the translators in the audience as the only ones to his mind who truly know how to read and write. Ceux et celles que je tiens pour les seuls à savoir lire et écrire, les traductrices et les traducteurs. Derrida's description here recalls a primary concern of judicial rhetoric, as Quintilian notes in Institutio Oratoria 4.1.16, praising the judge and associating this praise to the ideas that the speaker wishes to convey persuasively allows the speaker to prepare the audience to be more favorably inclined towards these ideas. Derrida's praise of his audience also recalls medieval translations of this Latin rhetorical precept, as we find in Brunetto Latini's Rhetorica, his 13th century Italian translation of Cicero's De Inventione. And Latini writes, the orator can acquire the benevolence of the listeners by speaking of their good qualities and praising their deeds, their strength, candor and valor, reason and meekness, that is, their restrained humility. We move from this logically, actually, into Derrida's use of a humility discourse. Here, Derrida asks how he, Derrida the philosopher, dares to speak on translation to an audience of specialists in literary translation and at a conference organized by them. He does so by invoking the daring of giving this lecture before these experts in translation, as suggested in his repetition of forms of the verb to dare. Comment oser parler de la traduction devant vous? Comment oserais-je m'avancer devant vous? Si j'ose aborder ce sujet devant vous. He's constantly repeating this. Here, Derrida recalls such foundational texts of classical rhetoric as Cicero's De Inventione 1:16-22 and Quintilian Institutio Oratoria 4.1.8. He also makes this scholar think of the Italian notary Giovanni da Vigno, who provides an example of such a modest approach to speech in his early 14th century Flor de Pilar, as he apologizes for his humble speech, his poor wit, and any faulty expression he may make. Derrida's seeming self-deprecation thus points to the frequently found rhetorical trope of feebleness, the excusatio propter infirmitatem, which derives from judicial oratory and aims to dispose the judges favorably. But we also may consider Derrida's use of this as an affected modesty topos, as described by E.R. Curtius. Although the literary translators in the audience may have been drawn in by Derrida's gestures of humility, anyone with the slightest knowledge of his scholarly background would have seen them as slippery and even ironic, as his first major publication was a translation, with an introduction, of Husserl's The Origin of Geometry. So Derrida was known for his translations. Rather than simply an immense monologue, as Hélène Cixous describes it then, Derrida's discourse is rhetorical. It performs speech in such a way as to fall within Austin's characterization of performative speech acts, which in turn points to Derrida's familiarity with and his use of standard techniques of oratory. However, his rhetorical interventions do not remain at the level of the application of classical precepts of effective oratory. They quickly become a means to demonstrate how merci, or the demand for pardon, is central in this lecture and in his rhetorical relationship with his audience. Cixous has noted that the whole adventure of Derrida's thought is a hunt and chase of symptom words, cleft words that beetle over their base, clefts through which world commotions are produced. And that was the end of my citation of her. When such words are polysemic, homophonic, and interlingual, they not only call out for what Batchelor has described as experimental prowling, but also underscore how, for Derrida, translation's very design is a passage à la philosophie. Whereas a textual reading of Derrida's Atlas lecture on relevant translation will privilege, and rightly so, the term relevant and its linguistic network, a reading of this lecture as rhetorically inflected changes the focus, placing more weight on merci as its call de traduction. That is, the rhetoricity of Derrida's lecture troubles our reading of relevant, and by extension of the nature of a relevant translation, fostering a shift in our focus from glossing the etymological and bilingual semantics of relevant toward that of merci. As a result, a rhetorical reading of this lecture is especially useful for understanding how Derrida's traduction relevante is tied to merci. Or, in the words of Catherine Trusted, Derrida ultimately suggests that mercy is in some ways irrelevant. Indeed, Derrida places merci at the center of his relationship with his audience in this Atlas lecture, as he repeatedly thanks his listeners and calls on them to extend mercy to him. Although evocations of mercy and merci are numerous throughout this lecture, we have only to consider here two examples with which Derrida frames his lecture by evoking these terms. Near the opening of his lecture, Derrida directs his gratitude and mercy to his audience by gesturing at the interlingualism of these terms, which the transcript highlights by its use of italics. And this is the first citation. Mais je ne tarderai pas davantage à vous dire merci à un mot, à vous adresser ce merci en plus d'une langue. I'm going to be tripping over these two words. I apologize. It's going to be interesting how this will go. Similarly, Derrida's concluding words turn once again to this interlingual homophonic pair. Merci pour le temps que vous m'avez donné. Pardon, merci. Pardon pour celui que je vous ai pris. I'm giving an American accent, I realized, to that mercy, which Derrida wouldn't have done. I mean, I think we have to remember that Derrida is speaking in France to a French audience. He's speaking in French, and I'm distinguishing the merci from the mercy. But I think that hearing Derrida speak, it would have been much less noticeable. Such appeals could feel as though they are standard, part and parcel of any public speech. However, the homophonic and interlingual pair merci here has rhetorical presence because Derrida is embedding two different concepts within this direct address to his audience. He's embedding the concept of mercy, as we know it, with gratitude. His framing of the lecture in terms of a gratitude, then, that veers into an appeal for mercy, thus has the effect of sharpening our attention to how his speech invites a response, and is thus bound up with effects, as J.L. Austin has said. This rhetorical use of merci in this lecture also evokes and signposts its relationship, the relationship of the lecture, to the seminars on perjury and forgiveness that Derrida gave over the 1997-1998 academic year. We know, as Batchelor has pointed out, that Derrida recycled most of his commentary on translating The Merchant of Venice, the touchstone of this 1998 lecture, given before the literary translators, especially from the second seminar of this series that was given in November of 1997. There are, however, other intriguing rhetorical overlaps between the first two seminars that Derrida gave and Derrida's use of this homophonic pair merci in this Atlas lecture. In the two initial seminars, Derrida performs the terms pardon and merci as speech acts, opening the first seminar by declaring pardon, oui, pardon, and the second seminar by saying pardon, merci. The second seminar evokes the first, creating a conscious reiteration that by means of rhetorical links, links pardon in English mercy with merci. So you see, he begins the first seminar and then purposefully in the second seminar echoes what happened in the first seminar, but he's going to move us into this dynamic of mercy, pardon, and merci. In addition, although he initially lodges both pardon and merci in French, and in the first seminar he does so explicitly, saying je viens de dire pardon en français, he quickly provides multilingual etymological links for both, highlighting the vernacular forms of pardon in the first seminar and the Latin cognates of merci, including such Latin terms of merces, mercredi, and mercimonium. And finally, Derrida also stresses in the second seminar that merci has a performative aspect. He calls it un mode performatif, which is also operative, as we have seen in his lecture before the translators of Atlas. The performative aspect that Derrida attributes to his use of merci in the second seminar is echoed in the Atlas lecture in reference to the English word merciful. Here, Derrida explicitly portrays himself as a speech act theorist when he uses it. And this is the citation on the screen here. De votre côté, pardonnez-moi d'abord de me servir de ce mot merciful comme d'une citation. Je le mentionne autant que j'en use, comme dirait un théoricien des speech acts un peu trop confident dans une distinction maintenant canonique entre mention et use. First, glossing this passage, we see that the way in which Derrida distinguishes between mention and use, it's interesting that he may have, and we don't have a recording of it, said these words with more of an reference to their existence in English, because he's referring specifically to Austen. The way in which Derrida distinguishes between mention and use, even as he unsettles the theoretical ground of this distinction, draws the audience's attention to the doubled function of merciful, compelling an awareness that this word has illocutionary force in Austen's terms. Second, his characterization of merciful as a citation ties it to his notion of indefinite iterability, which can break with any given context and yet engender an infinity of new contexts. In addition, it also evokes the possibility that multiple starting points and even multiple linguistic starting points may bear similar axiological weight, as observed in rhetorical argumentation when it is considered as regressive. Finally, seeing merciful as a citation also recalls the well-known and long-standing use of citation and quotation as rhetorical appeals to authority that are used in order to establish communion with an audience. That Derrida engages the translators in the audience at his Atlas lecture to grasp this English word merciful, autrement, is instructive for our reading of the homophonic pair merci, merci. Like merciful, Derrida performs merci. mercy, as speech acts. We hear them in resonance with merciful and is equally performative in nature. They are utterances that are not just saying something, but that are performing an action. Glossing Derrida's use of mercy in this Atlas lecture as rhetorical speech acts means then that we are meant to see these terms as doing something. But what is it exactly that this pair, mercy, merci, does, besides recall those earlier seminars? As Spivak tells us, the rhetoric of a source text may be for the translator inherently disruptive, as it frays the linguistic and textile surface of the text into sites of resistance. Similarly, I believe here that Derrida's rhetorical positioning of the multilingual and polysemic homophonic pair merci, merci directs his audience to wander into a kind of frayage, down those meandering paths of what may seem to be obscure meaning, but which is in fact essential to the present reading of the translator, having a public role. That is, the overt rhetoric of Derrida's discourse recalls Peter Stout's statement that intentional speech acts may have unintended consequences. For our purposes, the unintended consequences include the possibility that there may be something simultaneously much more personal and much more public going on here. Moreover, it may be that what's at stake here has something to do with Derrida's own rhetorical ethos, and by extension, the very political concerns underlying his translational and glossatory act. If the polysemic interlingualism of merci, merci produces, in terms borrowed from Digne, a reciprocal hospitality between languages, and perhaps even Bermond's mise en rapport, here its rhetorical force elicits questions of identity and power. In fact, what we see in this Atlas lecture is Derrida constructing an ethos, by which I mean the way in which the speaker's own character becomes a tool of persuasion, as described, for example, in Aristotle's Rhetoric. Ethos might be performative in nature, recalling Judith Butler's work on the performance of gender, but it is also discursive, permitting an intersection, as usefully studied by Ruth Amacy, between rhetoric and sociology, and we might also add between speech act theory and discourse analysis, and thus between ethos and self-presentation. In other words, Derrida translates Portia's line, when mercy seasons justice, and you have the quotation here, not only with quand le pardon relève la justice, but also rhetorically speaking with himself. Derrida's rhetorical ethos is produced by and in the parole, his saying of the lecture, that is, in the exteriorization he makes in speech of interior sentiment and thought. He rhetorically implicates himself in a public way in the philosophical wrangling that he discusses, and more precisely, in the negotiation that is the act of mercy. This tie between exteriorization and oratory is made explicit in Derrida's own earlier work, which explains how speech itself produces an exteriorization of inner thought. Recall how in his 1967 Speech and Phenomena, his gloss on Husserl's sixth logical investigation, Derrida had noted that, and I quote, speech is in essence expressive because it consists in carrying outside, in exteriorizing, a content of interior thought. We see this too in his Atlas lecture, as Françoise Dastur aptly explains. Derrida insists in this lecture on the fact that in uttering a word, he elevates himself to the level of its ideal content. We find this exteriorization manifest in the terms that are vital for our understanding of mercy, merci in the Atlas lecture. Mercy and forgiveness, le pardon, and their counterpart, mercy. First, As an expression, merci has the role of exteriorizing an inner feeling of gratitude. As Derrida writes in his second seminar on perjury and forgiveness, and pardon, merci, le mot merci, cette phrase abrégée par laquelle, sur un mode performatif, on marque sa reconnaissance pour un don, une grâce, une faveur accordée, une récompense, donc l'expression performative d'une gratitude. Note here that we see in his description the concept of a speech act or the performance of discourse. Second, in Derrida's Atlas lecture, we also find forgiveness, le pardon, as the inner concept that is exteriorized as pity, miséricorde. Elle, and he's referring here to la toute-puissance du pardon, doit être intérieure, spirituelle, idéale, dans le cœur du roi et non dans ses attributs extérieurs. Le passage de la limite suit évidemment cette trajectoire d'une intériorisation. Celle-ci se rendue visible à l'invisible en devenant chose du cœur, le pardon comme miséricorde. Just as merci is the exteriorized expression tied to the inner sentiment of gratitude, forgiveness or mercy undergoes an exteriorization to become pity. Even, and this is a little bit of an aside, but even Venuti's translation is instructive here, as he adds to the same notion of exteriorization by attributing it to mercy. So, just to say that Venuti translated Derrida's Atlas lecture in 2001, and this is very much the standard reading that MA students, at least that I know of in the UK, read and would read this, but this particular uh, uh, gloss that he does. So Venuti joins an intriguing gloss to this English translation of Derrida's Atlas lecture. This gloss, which Venuti marks out in brackets and in italics, and I've put it in bold in addition so you can see it more clearly, is tied to Derrida's statement of how he translates Portia's line from The Merchant of Venice. So Derrida notes, je traduirai donc seasons par relève, quand le pardon relève la justice ou le droit. And Venuti in his English translation of the statement adds, I shall therefore translate seasons as relève. When mercy seasons justice, quand le pardon relève la justice ou le droit, when mercy elevates and interiorizes, thereby preserving and negating justice or the law. From this gloss, from Venuti's gloss, we see that his translation, Venuti's translation practice, while highly interpretive, also allows us to draw a direct tie between merci, forgiveness, and mercy, as interior concepts all undergo this process of exteriorization, and particularly, I think, in Derrida's speech before the Atlas literary translators. Consequently, just as Derrida seasons and elevates mercy, merci, by means of a thoroughly rhetorical emphasis tied to the performative nature of his lecture on translation, he is at once exteriorizing and interiorizing the problem of mercy as a part of his rhetorical ethos. The contours that Derrida paints of mercy, merci, in his lecture before the translators of Atlas and in his seminars on perjury and forgiveness allow us to characterize this homophonic pair as a truchement. And I'm referring here to the concept offered by Dienne very recently. A truchement as an intermediary between languages and cultures in which power is at play. It is no accident that Derrida adds the notion of law, le droit, to his translation of When Mercy Seasons Justice, as it not only recalls and I'm quoting from an article from my colleague David Frank, the tension God faced at the beginning of creation between justice and mercy, as discussed in traditional Jewish interpretations of Genesis, but it also recalls the Pauline opposition between the dead letter of the law and the living spirit of the law, which, for Trusted, Shakespeare's character Shylock deconstructs. Ultimately, the exteriorizing of merci also creates a truchement between Derrida and Shylock in Derrida's reading of The Merchant of Venice. In his Atlas lecture, just as in his seminars on perjury and forgiveness, Derrida's rhetorical ethos is caught up with and responding then to the character of Shylock and to Shylock's fate as a Jew in the anti-Semitic Christian world presented in the 16th century play. That is, Derrida's ethos is produced in his use of merci as a response to the characters of Shakespeare's play, and primarily to Shylock, and is manifest in the lecture in his replication of confession and in his refusal of conversion. Our rhetorical gloss of Derrida's reading of The Merchant of Venice reveals two themes fundamental for Derrida's ethos. First, that of Christian confession and Jewish conversion, and then mercy as an economic and symbolic exchange that differentiates Christianity from Judaism. Consider first Antonio's confession. In his gloss, the confession is Portia says, "Do you confess the bond?" And Antonio says, "I do." In his gloss before the Atlas translators, Derrida highlights how Antonio, in confessing and acknowledging his debt or his bond, performs a speech act and points out that it is Antonio's performative "I do" that obligates Shylock to be merciful and consequently to lose his fortune and his religion, in other words, to convert. However, in this lecture, we see, or we rather hear, Derrida himself making a confession. We have seen above how Derrida frames his lecture with appeals to the audience for their mercy. Similarly, he uses an appeal to mercy to introduce this confession. His invocations of thanks, merci, are superimposed with entreaties for forgiveness, mercy. Car à peine vous aurais-je remercié pour l'hospitalité dont vous m'honorez, qu'il me faudra vous demander pardon, et vous rendant grâce, implorer votre grâce, vous demander d'être pour moi merciful. Following this appeal, this introduction to his confession, he performs confession in a threefold manner. First, for speaking in a bilingual, untranslatable, and thus inhospitable way to a monolingual audience, which quite frankly is somewhat cheeky considering that he's speaking to an audience of translators. J'avoue en premier lieu une faute au langage qui pourrait bien être un manquement aux lois de l'hospitalité. Second, he confesses, appealing for the audience's mercy, for speaking of his title in a manner that is untranslatable. L'un des aveux est de parler comme je le ferai dans un instant, de façon tout intraduisible du titre. And finally, he confesses, or he apologizes in advance for having this untranslatability as his signature mark as both translator and philosopher. Et peut-être devrais-je ensuite avouer, plaidant ainsi coupable sans circonstance atténuante, que c'est d'abord à ce titre, à savoir son intraductibilité, que je l'ai choisi, mon titre, préméditant ainsi mon crime, complotant à un mot pour faire de l'apparente intraductibilité de mon titre, de mots en lui que je signe, de l'idiome de quelque chose comme ma signature, le thème de cette conférence, qui ressemblera donc à un sot qui, honte ou arrogance, s'abrégerait un paraphe. And notice all of those, notice all of the ritual of pleading guilty and of being a criminal. So he's confessing to the crime of being of being himself signing this untranslatability. Well, we might recall here, I've moved ahead a little bit too quickly, excuse me. Well, we might recall here the Derridian notion of signature as studied by Camus. This lengthy passage provides a confessional climax of sorts to Derrida's humility statements, his expressions of gratitude, and the appeals for mercy that he makes in this lecture. Cixous sees in this performance of confession Derrida staging the drama of unsolvable debt and therefore of forgiveness. Derrida, I think, indeed does place forgiveness and mercy at the center of his confession, but as a rhetorical proclamation of confession that he's making, he's also fashioning an analogy with Antonio rather than with Shylock. So he has Antonio, he points out how Antonio is confessing, and he himself is also confessing as a part of this lecture. Second, the notion of exchange is also key here. Exchange is an essential aspect of Antonio's confession because it requires Shylock's conversion in return. Similarly, the homophonic pair, mercy, merci, is lexically and symbolically a value of exchange in an economic market. And he talks about it as evoking trade or working for a salary. In a philosophical reading of Merci from his second seminar, Derrida explained that the very word itself symbolized the circularity of exchange in which the offering of a gift must be mirrored by the recipient's gratitude for it. Le nom merci signifie cet échange, cette symbolisation d'un échange du marché des valeurs d'échange, le cercle speculaire de cette économie et de sa reconnaissance. As a result, as Derrida concludes in his seminar in bilingual fashion, to be merciful is to be both grateful and forgiving, capable of giving in return. Être merciful, c'est à la fois être reconnaissant et miséricordieux, capable de donner en retour. But as we read later in his fifth seminar that was given in early 1998, Derrida pointedly notes that Jews are not known for being capable of giving in return. Derrida characterizes Christians as tied to the living word, credit with a lowercase c, and mercy, whereas Jews are associated with, that credit is with a uppercase, whereas Jews are associated with writing, banks, money, and the incapacity to forgive. Vous allez voir en équivalence d'un côté la parole vivante et miséricordieuse qui fonde la confiance, la promesse, qui se passe donc du crédit au sens bancaire et financier, et puis en face de cette parole vivante, n'est-ce pas, et miséricordieuse qui est celle des chrétiens, il y a l'écriture du crédit, I'm sorry, the accent was wiped out there, de la banque, de l'argent qui sont du côté du juif en tant qu'il est incapable du pardon. Given the sharp division of mercy along religious lines, it's hardly surprising to read that Derrida wonders early in his second seminar whether forgiveness must break with this economy and in turn break with the biblical traditions that generate and uphold it. Derrida's ruminations are answered in his Atlas lecture by his rhetorical posture as regards mercy, merci, and by the positions he takes on translation and conversion, which he associates in this lecture. First, he describes the impossibility of translation as conversion, using the classical terms for translation, vertere, transvertere, convertere, as employed by Cicero. But translation as conversion in this lecture is also intimately related to the conversion that Shylock, as a Jew, is compelled to make, as Derrida portrays both Shylock's financial loss and conversion in terms of translation. Shylock perdra tout dans cette traduction de transaction. Il aura même à se convertir au christianisme, à se traduire convertere en chrétien. In his gloss, then, Derrida both plays once again on the etymological links between translation and conversion, recalling De Oratory of Cicero, but he also pointedly ties Shylock's particular fate to the unsavory translation that is forced religious conversion. Significantly, and this is, I think, really key to understanding what Derrida is doing as a public translator. If we read this Atlas lecture in a rhetorical way, Derrida is rejecting both Shylock's conversion and the translation that's a necessary part of it. His performance of confession at the Atlas lecture, as we've already seen, upends the power relations implicit in Antonio's confession. Derrida rebuffs this obligation that a Jew must provide mercy, an obligation which falls like a verdict, tombe comme une sentence, Derrida says. Moreover, again, in the opening lines of this lecture, and he says it throughout, Derrida refuses to translate. He refuses to sign, as Batchelor points out, Portia's line, then the Jew must be merciful, agreeing only to translate when mercy seasons justice. Again, we have that Je ne traduis pas cette phrase de Portia dans Le Marchand de Venise. Derrida's rhetorical ethos allows us to see precisely what he does endorse in translating from this play, as he both responds to and sidesteps what in his elsewhere in this lecture he characterizes as the Abrahamic business, l'affaire abrahamique, of translation as exchange or conversion between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. We know that Derrida draws his reading of The Merchant of Venice in this Atlas address from the second seminar. However, what Derrida does not include from his seminar provides an acutely political and historical lens through which to grasp the lecture and the rhetorical way in which it's positioning translation. This is key, for underlying his gloss of The Merchant of Venice in the Atlas lecture are concerns that are as much diachronic as they are socio-historical. It is here that we must turn most usefully to the notion of values with which rhetorical ethos is associated. As Michel Mayer writes, there is no action or ethos in general which does not implicitly rely or extol some value or values. Values are the instruments linked to ethos for convincing, argumentation, or for influencing and pleasing an audience, rhetoric. Derrida, keenly aware of the values at play in Shylock's position and fate, and especially of how merci functions as a commodity of exchange therein, fashions his rhetorical ethos as a way of repositioning the values of merci and mercy outside of this paradigm of necessary exchange. In fact, in his seminars, Derrida broadens the temporal import and the topical import of Portia's obligation for the Jewish Shylock to be merciful far beyond the boundaries of both the literary world and the temporal context of Shakespeare's play. We see this in two notable details. First, in the second seminar, Derrida overtly explains his gloss of Shakespeare by linking it to the Jewish question, which describes the uneasy place of Jews as a social group in the world. That is, the seemingly eternal Jewish question, la question juive de notre temps et tous les temps. It is this Jewish question, that inspires and even necessitates his gloss of these lines from The Merchant of Venice. He doesn't include this, la question juive de notre temps et de tous les temps, in his lecture before the Atlas translators, but you'll remember that he's taken most of his gloss from the second seminar and placed it as a part of this Atlas lecture. So it's really important that he's, in a sense, left the Jewish question out, but it's present. Uh, it's present in a very specular way, I think. It's hovering in the background. We consequently cannot understand his reading of the play or the translation of Portia's lines from it without the knowledge that it is the Jewish question which in specular fashion motivates it. Second, and more importantly, in a sixth seminar, Derrida describes a temporal lineage of conflict between Jew and Christian underlying this notion of mercy as exchange, and which in turn stages the drama between these two religious groups. That is, he characterizes the Abrahamic form of forgiveness as operative not only in Shakespeare's play, but also in the Shoah. Le pardon abrahamique est comme une scène entre le juif et le chrétien, chose sur laquelle nous ne cessons d'insister, qu'il agisse de la Shoah, des crimes contre l'humanité et de l'imprescriptibilité jusqu'aux marchands de Venise. Derrida thus grounds the Shoah and crimes against humanity and the Merchant of Venice in this originary conflict. And yet, the rhetorical impact of his words, remember he's speaking these seminars, his rhetorical ethos performs an inverse movement, shifting his translation of the play's crucial lines into more recent history. He transports, in so doing, his listeners beyond the late 16th century into the more recent past, beyond the translation of literature, into the realities of history and politics, presenting an ethos tied to broad socio-political questions. The mercy that Derrida compels in this lecture, then, is our attention to, or that we attend to, what underlines his translation of When Mercy Seasons Justice, that is, this ever-present, still present issue of the Jewish question. And I'm coming to rapidly to my conclusion here. Endowed with extensive rhetorical features, Derrida creates in his lecture to the literary translators of Atlas an intricate performance of standard oratorical tools that place a spotlight on the interlingual homophonic pair, merci, merci, as a relevant. Moreover, he fashions his rhetorical ethos in terms of a mercy, merci, that is a direct response to Shylock's conversion in The Merchant of Venice. But Derrida does not let us rest easily in the past. His ethos also indicates the extent to which the speaking subject is politically an active subject, recalling, in the words of Hannah Arendt, how, and I quote, the capacity for acting and speaking is but another mode of acting, makes us political beings. Derrida thus situates his ethos as translator, his rhetorical ethos as translator, solidly in the public realm, and makes an active ethical appeal via the lecture's resonances with his seminars to the real-world stakes of translating in general and of translating The Merchant of Venice in particular. Thank you.